Welcome back to Neural Battlefields, where we dissect the strategic minds, the battles, and the empires that shaped our world. Today, we're diving into one of history's most powerful and controversial empires, an empire so vast that the sun never set on its territories. This is the story of the British Empire, a tale of ambition, exploitation, innovation, and consequences that echo through our world even today. If you're ready to uncover the sinister truths behind colonization and understand how a small island nation came to control nearly a quarter of the world's population, then stay with us. And if you find value in what we explore today, consider hitting that subscribe button and sharing this video with anyone interested in the real forces that shaped modern civilization. Let's begin. Imagine standing on the docks of London in the year 1497. The air smells of salt and tar, merchants shout about their wares, and a small ship prepares to set sail into the unknown Atlantic. Aboard is John Cabot, an Italian explorer sailing under the English flag, about to plant the seeds of what would become the largest empire in human history. But this wasn't just about exploration or discovery. This was the beginning of a systematic extraction of wealth, resources, and human dignity on a scale the world had never seen. The British Empire didn't emerge overnight. It grew slowly, methodically, like a predator stalking its prey across centuries. And unlike the Spanish conquistadors who sought immediate gold and glory, the British developed something far more insidious: a system. A system of control, extraction, and domination that would persist for over 400 years. In the early 1600s, while much of Europe was tearing itself apart in religious wars, English merchants were forming something revolutionary: the East India Company. Now this wasn't just a trading company. This was a corporation with its own army, its own navy, and eventually its own territories. Think about that for a moment. A private company backed by royal charter was given permission to wage war, negotiate treaties, and rule over foreign lands. This was capitalism and imperialism, merged into one terrifying entity. The company's arrival in India changed everything. The Mughal Empire, one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated civilizations of its time, became the target. But the British didn't conquer India through superior military might alone. They conquered it through manipulation, through exploiting existing divisions, through turning Indians against Indians. They mastered the art of divide and rule, a strategy so effective that it would become the blueprint for colonial control worldwide. Picture the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Robert Clive, with fewer than 3,000 men, faced an army of 50,000 soldiers commanded by the Nawab of Bengal. On paper, this should have been a massacre, but Clive had bought off the Nawab's commander, Mir Jafar, with promises of power. When the battle began, Mir Jafar's troops stood idle, watching as their own people were slaughtered. This wasn't just a military victory. This was a demonstration of how corruption and betrayal could be weaponized to destroy nations from within. After Plassey, the floodgates opened. The East India Company didn't just trade anymore. It taxed, it governed, it extracted, and the wealth that flowed from India to Britain was staggering. Historians estimate that between 1765 and 1938, Britain drained approximately $45 trillion worth of wealth from India alone. Let that number sink in. $45 trillion. This wasn't trade. This was systematic looting on an unimaginable scale. But India was just one piece of the puzzle. While the East India Company was consolidating power in Asia, British ships were sailing to Africa, to the Caribbean, to the Americas. And they weren't going there just for resources. They were going there for something even more profitable: human beings. The transatlantic slave trade represents one of the darkest chapters in human history, and Britain was its most successful practitioner. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, British ships transported over 3 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. These weren't just numbers. These were human beings, torn from their families, branded like cattle, chained in the suffocating darkness of ship holds where 1 in 5 would die before reaching the Caribbean or American plantations. The economics were brutal in their simplicity. British ships would sail to Africa carrying manufactured goods, guns, and textiles. They would trade these for enslaved people. These people would be transported to the Americas and the Caribbean, where they would be sold to plantation owners. The ships would then return to Britain loaded with sugar, tobacco, cotton, and rum, products created through slave labor. This triangular trade created immense wealth for British merchants, shipowners, and investors. Cities like Liverpool, Bristol, and London were built on the profits of human misery. And here's what makes this even more sinister. The British convinced themselves and tried to convince the world that this was somehow natural, somehow justified. They created entire pseudoscientific theories about racial hierarchies. They used religion to argue that slavery was divinely ordained. They built an intellectual framework to justify the unjustifiable, a framework whose poison still infects our world today. By the 19th century, something strange began to happen. Britain, the world's leading slave-trading nation, suddenly became the world's leading opponent of slavery. In 1807, they abolished the slave trade. In 1833, they abolished slavery throughout most of the empire. But was this a moral awakening, or was it strategic repositioning? The Industrial Revolution had changed the game. Britain no longer needed slaves when they had machines, but they still needed cheap labor, they still needed raw materials, and they still needed markets for their manufactured goods. So slavery was replaced with something almost as exploitative: colonial wage labor, land theft, and economic domination. Let's talk about what happened in Kenya during the 20th century, long after slavery was supposedly abolished. British colonizers wanted the fertile highlands for coffee and tea plantations, but the Kikuyu people lived there. The solution: simply take the land, declare it crown land, force the Kikuyu into reserves or make them work on the very land that had been stolen from them, now as laborers for British settlers. When they resisted, when the Mau Mau Rebellion erupted in the 1950s, the British response was brutal. Detention camps, torture, mass executions. Documents that the British government tried to hide for decades revealed systematic human rights abuses. Over 100,000 Kikuyu were detained, and thousands were killed. Or consider what happened in Ireland, Britain's oldest colony. The Great Famine of 1845 to 1852 killed approximately 1 million Irish people and forced another million to emigrate. But here's the thing: Ireland was producing enough food to feed its population. The problem was that most of that food, the cattle, the grain, the dairy, was being exported to Britain by absentee landlords while the Irish, dependent on the potato crop that failed, starved. The British government, guided by laissez-faire economic ideology, refused to intervene effectively. In fact, some British officials saw the famine as a natural solution to Irish overpopulation. This wasn't a natural disaster. This was policy-driven death. The pattern repeated across the empire. In Bengal in 1943, another famine killed between 2 and 3 million people. Again, this wasn't because of a total lack of food. It was because the British prioritized feeding their troops and stockpiling food for the war effort over feeding the local population. Winston Churchill, when informed of the famine, allegedly asked why Gandhi hadn't died yet if the situation was so bad. His policies prioritized British interests over Indian lives, and millions paid the price. But the British Empire wasn't just about extraction of resources and exploitation of labor. It was also about cultural destruction. When the British arrived in Australia in 1788, there were hundreds of distinct Aboriginal nations, each with their own languages, cultures, and laws. The British declared the land terra nullius, empty land, as if the people who had lived there for over 65,000 years simply didn't exist. Aboriginal children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in missions and institutions to civilize them, to make them forget their languages, their cultures, their very identities. This continued well into the 20th century, creating what Australians now call the stolen generations. The same cultural genocide occurred in Canada with the First Nations peoples, in New Zealand with the Maori, in South Africa with multiple indigenous groups. The goal was always the same: erase indigenous cultures and replace them with British values, British language, British systems. This wasn't just colonization of land. This was colonization of minds. Now, defenders of the British Empire will point to the railways they built, the legal systems they established, the schools they opened. And yes, these things existed, but let's be clear about why they existed. The railways weren't built to help Indians travel. They were built to extract resources from the interior and transport them to ports for shipment to Britain. The legal systems weren't created to deliver justice to the colonized. They were created to protect British property and maintain order. The schools weren't open to educate. They were open to create a class of English-speaking clerks and administrators who would help run the empire. This is what the historian Mike Davis calls the Victorian Holocaust. During the late 19th century, as Britain was celebrating its technological advancement and moral superiority, its colonial policies were creating famines that killed tens of millions of people across India, China, and Africa. These famines occurred not despite British rule, but because of it. Traditional farming practices were disrupted. Local food storage systems were dismantled. Export-oriented agriculture was forced upon populations. And when crops failed, the market-based policies championed by the British ensured that food would go to whoever could pay the most, not to whoever needed it most. The economic impact of colonialism is still debated by historians, but some facts are undeniable. When the British arrived in India, the Indian subcontinent accounted for approximately 23% of global GDP. When they left in 1947, that figure had dropped to just 4%. Britain industrialized on the backs of its colonies, using their raw materials and their markets while preventing them from industrializing themselves. Indian textiles, once the finest in the world, were deliberately destroyed to create markets for British-manufactured cloth. Indian blacksmiths had their thumbs cut off to prevent them from competing with British steel. But perhaps the most insidious legacy of the British Empire isn't economic. It's psychological and political. The borders that the British drew, often with no regard for ethnic, linguistic, or cultural boundaries, continue to cause conflicts today. The partition of India and Pakistan in 1947, rushed through by the British as they departed, led to one of the largest mass migrations in history and communal violence that killed between 1 and 2 million people. The arbitrary borders drawn in Africa divided peoples and forced together groups with different traditions, creating tensions that exploded into genocides and civil wars in the decades after independence. The British also perfected the art of creating comprador classes, local elites who benefited from colonial rule and who often continued to serve foreign interests even after independence. This meant that even when the British flag was lowered, British economic and political influence often remained, just more subtly exercised. By the mid-20th century, the empire was crumbling. 2 world wars had exhausted Britain economically and morally. Independence movements, fueled by leaders like Gandhi, Nehru, Nkrumah, and Kenyatta, could no longer be suppressed. But the British didn't leave gracefully. In nearly every colony, they left behind deliberately created problems. In Palestine, they made contradictory promises to Arabs and Jews, creating a conflict that persists today. In Cyprus, they encouraged Greek and Turkish division. In Sudan, they drew borders that would lead to decades of civil war. And here's something that should make us uncomfortable. The wealth that built modern Britain, the grand buildings in London, the country estates, the accumulated capital that jump-started the Industrial Revolution, much of it came from colonialism. It came from slavery, from looting, from exploitation. And while Britain has never paid reparations for this wealth, while it has never truly accounted for the violence committed in its name, the descendants of the colonized still live with the consequences. Today, when we look at global inequality, when we see why some nations are rich and others are poor, We can't understand it without understanding colonialism. The wealth gap between the global North and the global South isn't an accident. It's a product of centuries of systematic extraction. The British Empire, like other colonial empires, created a world system where resources flow from the periphery to the center, a system that in many ways continues today under different names. But this isn't just a story about the past. The legacy of the British Empire shapes our present in countless ways. English is a global language not because of its inherent superiority, but because it was forced upon hundreds of millions of people. The Westminster parliamentary system, replicated in dozens of countries, carries with it both democratic principles and the authoritarian methods developed to control colonies. The borders on our maps, the divisions between nations, the conflicts that dominate our news, so many of these trace their roots to decisions made in London by men who had never even visited the places they were carving up. And perhaps most importantly, the British Empire established patterns of thinking that persist. The idea that some peoples are more civilized than others. The notion that economic development requires outside intervention. The belief that Western values are universal values. These ideas, born in the colonial era, still shape how we think about development, about intervention, about who has the right to determine the future of which nations. So what do we do with this history? How do we reckon with an empire that shaped the modern world in such profound and often terrible ways? Some argue we should judge historical figures by the standards of their time. But even by the standards of their time, voices were raised against slavery, against exploitation, against colonial violence. Those voices were ignored because they threatened profits, because they challenged power. Others argue that we should focus on the positive contributions of the empire, but this is like praising a thief for the quality of the safe he installed in the house he robbed. Yes, infrastructure was built. Yes, institutions were created, but they were built to serve the colonizer, not the colonized. And they came at a cost of millions of lives, of cultural destruction, of wealth extraction that continues to impact the world today. The truth is uncomfortable. The British Empire was built on violence, on racism, on exploitation. It enriched a small number of people while impoverishing millions. It advanced technology in some places while deliberately holding it back in others. It created the modern world, but it created a world of profound inequality, a world where the sins of the past continue to poison the present. Understanding this history doesn't mean hating Britain or British people. It means understanding how power works, how empires justify themselves, how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary crimes. It means recognizing that the comfortable lives some of us enjoy today were built on the suffering of others. And it means asking ourselves what we're going to do about it. The British Empire ended formally in the decades after World War II, but its legacy is immortal. Every time we see a political border that makes no sense, that's empire. Every time we see a language dying out, that's empire. Every time we see economic inequality that tracks perfectly with colonial history, that's empire. The battlefields where this empire was built may be quiet now, but the war it started, the war for resources, for power, for the right to determine one's own future, that war continues. Here at Neural Battlefields, we believe that understanding history isn't about assigning blame. It's about understanding the systems, the strategies, the decisions that shaped our world. The British Empire was a system of extraordinary effectiveness and extraordinary cruelty. It proved that a small nation could dominate the world if it was willing to be ruthless enough, strategic enough, and brutal enough. But it also proved that such dominance comes at a cost paid not just by those who were colonized, but ultimately by the colonizers themselves. The empire may have made Britain wealthy, but it also made Britain complicit in crimes that stain its history. It may have spread British values, but it did so through violence that contradicted those very values. It may have created a global system, but it created a system that perpetuates inequality and injustice. As we close this exploration, I want you to think about this. The British Empire didn't end because the British suddenly developed a conscience. It ended because it became too expensive to maintain, because resistance became too strong to suppress, because the moral justifications became too absurd to defend. Power, once it becomes too costly, is relinquished. But the structures it creates, the inequalities it establishes, the trauma it inflicts, those things persist. If you found this exploration valuable, if it made you think differently about how our world was shaped, then please consider subscribing to Neural Battlefields. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to understand this history. We're building a community of people who want to understand not just what happened, but why it happened and what it means for us today. Drop a comment below telling us what aspect of the British Empire you'd like us to explore deeper. Should we dive into specific colonies? Examine particular policies? Explore the resistance movements that ultimately brought the empire down? Your engagement shapes what we create next. Remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the forces that created our present and that will shape our future. The British Empire taught us that power unchecked leads to atrocity, that profit pursued without ethics leads to catastrophe, and that the stories we tell ourselves about our superiority are often just justifications for our sins. This has been Neural Battlefields, where we don't just study history, we dissect it. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and never stop questioning the stories you've been told. Thank you for watching.